Welcome everybody, welcome to Safeguarding Week and your North Yorkshire Safeguarding Children Partnership Safeguarding Masterclass this afternoon. We're going to be looking at working together to disrupt child exploitation in North Yorkshire. I'm just going to introduce myself. My name's Catherine Morrison. I'm a Policy and Development Officer for North Yorkshire Safeguarding Children Partnership, and I cover our multi-agency child exploitation arrangements. Gemma Orr, who I will, if you just want to introduce yourself, Gemma.
Hello, I'm Gemma Orr. I'm the Operational MACE Lead for the partnership at MACE Level 2, and I work alongside Kat at the partnership.
Well, I feel like
Thank you, Gemma. If I could just ask everyone to turn their microphones off, please, just so we can just minimise any background noise. Thank you very much. So yes, Gemma is going to be helping me by supporting me through the chat function today, just throughout the presentation. So just a little bit of housekeeping just before we make a start. We will make sure that you have myself and Gemma's email addresses, and you are welcome to kind of contact us after the presentation. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of the presentation as well. We do want this to be as interactive a session as possible, so please use the chat bar. That's what it's there for. We want to hear what you've got to say, and if you've got any questions, there are no silly questions with regards to exploitation. This is a real safe space for you to kind of ask anything that you may be curious about. As I've said, Gemma's going to keep an eye on the chat throughout the sessions for me, and there will be some times as well where we just ask for some of your thoughts and ideas based on some of the slides on the chat bar as well. So please contribute as much as you can. Just to make partners aware, we will be recording the presentation so we can upload this onto our partnership webpage and YouTube channel. So if you want to share this with any partners after the meeting, that's where you'll be able to access it. A reminder to partners that we do share everything on our YouTube channel. So I think Gemma's going to pop in the chat now the link for our YouTube channel. If you want to go on there and like and subscribe, you will be made aware of when we upload any additional videos or resources, not just in relation to exploitation, but all things safeguarding. Throughout the session, we will be talking about exploitation, but we will be looking at it from a contextual point of view. So I would ask that if we are having some discussions, we don't talk about any specific cases. We certainly don't name any kind of specific names or places. It's much more of a general conversation. Anything that you do want to bring up afterwards, we're more than happy to do so outside of the recording. And as I've said, we're here for an hour. I've got you today until 5 o'clock. I'm happy to stay around for a few extra minutes if anyone does have any questions that they'd like to raise outside of the meeting. So aims and objectives for the session today. We're going to be spending a little bit of time looking at some of the signs and indicators of exploitation, as well as some emerging themes and trends that we're picking up both nationally and in North Yorkshire. We're going to be looking at the multi-agency child exploitation processes in North Yorkshire and covering that alongside the modern slavery, human trafficking and the national referral mechanism, which we'll touch on again. The crux of why we're here, and we're going to spend a lot of time looking at disruption of exploitation, what it can look like, and most importantly, how we can all work together to disrupt exploitation. And we'll also be looking at what you can do if you are worried about a child and exploitation, and where you can go for further information and resources. So just to start off the presentation, when we're looking at exploitation, it falls under the umbrella of contextual safeguarding. Now, contextual safeguarding was first coined by Dr. Carleen Furman as part of her doctoral research. It explores the places and spaces young people spend their time and the harms that they may be exposed to within the communities, perhaps their school environments or within the parks, bus stations, clubs, etc., and the streets that they spend their time. So if you look at that bottom left-hand diagram on the slide, you can see those concentric circles around a young person, moving from the intrafamilial harms that a young person may experience inside the family home or in that family network, to the extrafamilial harms, moving towards that peer group, the school spaces, the neighbourhoods, the communities, the places and spaces where young people spend their time. Now, there's something missing off this diagram which would interweave intertwine and interweave seamlessly across all those rings with young people, and that's the online space. So a lot of us as adults sometimes see that online world as a separate space, a separate entity. For young people, that's not always the case. They will see that online world kind of merging with those places and spaces seamlessly. And when we're talking about exploitation, and particularly around disruption in those places and spaces, I really want you to be mindful of that online world as well as the physical spaces. Just to the right as well, you can see some of that language and terminology that we'll be looking at today linked to exploitation. So yeah, you can see you've got extrafamilial harm, sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, lots of the terminology that we'll be looking at today. So let's just start with a definition of exploitation. So to complicate matters, there isn't a nationally agreed definition of exploitation. As a partnership, we use the definition that's shared by the Government Home Office Disruption Toolkit. So it defines criminal exploitation as when an individual or group takes advantage of an imbalance of power to coerce, control, manipulate or deceive a child or young person under the age of 18. The victim may have been criminally exploited even if the activity appears consensual. It does not always involve physical contact and can also occur through the use of technology. Criminal exploitation often happens alongside sexual or other forms of exploitation, and broader than just county lines, and includes, for example, children forced to work on perhaps cannabis farms to commit theft, shoplift or pickpocket or threaten other young people. The definition of child sexual exploitation similarly occurs with that imbalance of power to coerce, manipulate or deceive a child or young person under the age of 18 into sexual activity in exchange for something the victim needs or wants, and or for the financial advantage of increased status of the perpetrator or facilitator. The victim may have been sexually exploited even if the sexual activity appears consensual. It does not always involve physical contact and can occur through the use of technology. So the key bit I really want you to take out of this slide is that even if the activity, be it criminal or sexual, appears consensual by that young person, they are still being exploited, they are still victims of exploitation, and they should be treated as such. So let's start a little by considering some of the signs and indicators of exploitation. Now, when we think of a young person who's being exploited, what are some of the signs that we as professionals may pick up? So I'm asking you now to just spend a couple of moments popping a few things in the chat for me. Some of those warning signs, some of those indicators that may start to raise some concerns that a young person may be being exploited. Gemma, if you can just keep an eye on the chat and just feedback a few that come through for me.
So far, Kat, we've got a change in behaviour and mannerisms. We've got secretive behaviour or more withdrawn. Again, change in behaviour, gifts from other people, secrecy or going missing from home, new friends or gifts, new friendship groups, often older, becoming withdrawn or angry, possessions they can't afford, money to spend on clothes, etc., unexplained gifts, influx of new things such as clothes, trainers, items of jewellery, not known where money and things are coming from, again, unexplained gifts and items, inappropriate sexual behaviour, isolation from normal friendship groups, concerning sexual behaviour, unexplained injuries, non-attendance at school. So real good.
Oh, this is amazing. It's clear that you guys have some amazing kind of insight already into what some of these signs of exploitation are. That's fantastic to hear. So I'll put this on here. You've covered most of them. One of the key things I really want you to kind of pick up from this one is the word change. So a few people have said about those changes in behaviour. it draws on the slide here around perhaps some of those more negative behaviour changes, so being a little bit more secretive, fearful, withdrawn, aggressive, be mindful of the nature of exploitation. And what perpetrators will often do when they're grooming a young person is give them the things that a young person they've perceived that a young person may want or need, and in some cases that's a sense of belonging, an increased level of confidence, a feeling of kind of a positive, what they feel is a positive relationship at the time. So you may see slightly more subtle changes in terms of changes of behaviour. You may see a young person who's suddenly becoming a lot more outgoing or a lot more confident, whereas perhaps they've been a little bit more withdrawn. So it's not always a be all and end all list in relation to the signs of exploitation. And my kind of key message to you guys is to be really mindful, be really curious, notice changes and think about what some of those reasons might be. The other thing that's coming through is just in relation to people talking about possessions, and just being mindful again that perpetrators are now very much picking up on the cost of living crisis, and not always brand new designer clothes and things like that. It can sometimes just be a meal, something that a young person may need that they will use to groom a young person. So let's have a think about what child exploitation looks like in North Yorkshire. So the first and most important thing to highlight is that despite North Yorkshire being a largely rural county, often seen as low crime, criminal and sexual exploitation of children does happen here. There is a common misconception it doesn't, and that exploitation is only an issue for larger cities and more urban areas, as this is what we often see portrayed in the media, you know, exploitation happening much more in city areas. Unfortunately, it can happen in all towns and rural areas across North Yorkshire, affecting all communities and children from all walks of life. The ways in which criminals will target and groom children in rural areas can be slightly different from those living in cities. Children living in the countryside can often be more isolated, and criminals will target that isolation, that boredom, that lack of opportunity by offering some of that excitement, that attention, that easy money. So again, and they'll target people in the countryside because there can sometimes be less of that police presence. So there's perhaps more unmanned bus and train stations, sparser CCTV. They take advantage of that misconception that, you know, people feel exploitation doesn't happen here. They feel like people aren't looking for it. So from a disruption point of view, the more we know about it, the more we're aware it's happening, we can just be more mindful of what's going on. And we've already talked about exploitation taking place both online and in those physical spaces where young people spend their time, often with the two overlapping. Places and spaces can include anywhere: bus stations, parks, people's houses, beauty spots, car parks, sports venues. And again, those online spaces can be things like through social media and online gaming, and through posts they can see perhaps glamorizing activities such as drug dealing, get rich quick schemes, things like that, encouraging young people to try these things. It can, as we've said, be quite hidden, and the signs can be difficult to spot, and it really does require that curiosity. And if you see those changes, it's about understanding why that might be happening and not just assuming that it's the child at fault. And most importantly, it's about sharing those concerns and reporting it. It's all key to disruption, and we'll look at this in more detail later on. So across North Yorkshire, I just kind of wanted to highlight some particular emerging themes and trends that we're picking up at the minute. Most of you will have been aware there's lots of media coverage in the minute about young people and vaping, and lots of things coming through about health concerns, but it's important as well to consider this from an exploitation point of view. Something that's been picked up locally and nationally as a trend is that perpetrators are using vapes as a tool for criminal exploitation. So for example, the buying and selling of vapes, and those contextual places and spaces as potential locations of concern, both the physical vape shops and those online sales as potential places where groomers can target young people. Financial exploitation. This is a really interesting one that's been raised by the Children's Society, and again increasingly linked to online exploitation, involving young people being groomed to open bank accounts to launder money, perpetrators using online gaming networks or social media, so the TikToks, to exploit vulnerable young people, and they'll cast that net really wide. They'll be putting this out to lots and lots of young people in the hopes that just a few of those individual vulnerable young people will engage back with them. Speaking again about the online world, perpetrators continue to target young people in those online places and spaces. They're doing so, like we say, through social media, through the gaming networks. These gaming rooms are an instant, they create that instant rapport between a perpetrator and a young person because they've got that shared interest in the game. And they can use those chat rooms to kind of really build that initial relationship. Often they'll entice young people to move then to a different app, so for example Snapchat, where you can find the location and those messages aren't saved. And with regards to apps like Snapchat, where we've now got the location tracking added, from the viewpoint of a perpetrator and a victim, the perpetrator can now use those tracking locations to know exactly where their victim is, and they have that virtual eyes on them all the time. I've already touched on this briefly. No news to anyone about the ongoing challenges faced by the cost of living crisis, and the sad fact is that perpetrators are now adapting the way they target and groom young people. So as we've said before, rather than kind of originally offering designer trainers and clothing, they can be offering young people essentials such as food and clothing, smaller items, and again something that's not necessarily as picked up as a warning sign by professionals. And then finally, something just to be mindful of, especially when we're talking about disruption, is the consideration of seasonal trends. So we're now moving rapidly towards the summer holidays and really thinking about young people spending more time outside in the local communities. It's more important than ever that we are all, as communities and partners, aware of what's going on and picking up those signs. So in North Yorkshire, if we do have concerns around young person and exploitation, what do we do? So exploitation should be seen as a safeguarding concern, and you would follow your own organisational safeguarding procedures. I'm aware there may be some people outside of North Yorkshire, so I would ask you to kind of follow your own local authority safeguarding procedures. But for those in North Yorkshire, Gemma's going to pop a link in the chat. We've got the Worried About a Child page on the partnership website, which takes you through all those safeguarding procedures. In North Yorkshire, our processes for supporting young people who are at risk of exploitation are detailed in our MACE strategy. And if a child is identified by a professional as being potentially at risk of exploitation, they would submit that safeguarding referral form. In North Yorkshire, that goes through to our multi-agency screening team, where the referral is screened by a partnership of professionals. So we've got children's social care, early help, police, health services, for example, and they will screen that referral and look at the appropriate level of support based on the level of need for that child and family. Now, if as part of that there is a concern around exploitation, then the allocated worker will build that picture with the young person, the family, and any of the workers who are in that young person's network, really kind of building a picture of what that exploitation looks like by completing an exploitation risk assessment. So if during the course of these discussions there are any specific contextual safeguarding concerns, so perhaps linking that young person with any potential perpetrators, if there's any group concerns, links to any potential locations, then they are carried through into our MACE level 2 meetings, which I'm just going to move on to next, just so you can get a clarity of the process. So across North Yorkshire, we do tackle exploitation across 2 levels. So our MACE level 1 is very much focused around that individual and the support in place for that individual. So as I've already said, the exploitation risk assessment is done, and then that is then taken back to our multi-agency screening team, who will assess, again as a partnership, that level of risk of exploitation around that young person. So they will deem whether there is no level of risk, or a low level of risk, a medium level of risk, or a high level of risk. And they will build a plan with that young person and with that family based on that level of risk to look at that support for them, to move them away from that world of exploitation. Our level 2 meetings are much more contextual, so they are chaired across our 7 locality areas across North Yorkshire, all done virtually, and they're discussing information relating to the links between children, the perpetrators, the individuals who pose a risk by exploitation, the locations that may be a concern, and particularly kind of the community intelligence, the building that picture of what it's looking like, and developing robust locality plans to pursue and prosecute perpetrators and disrupt exploitation activities within the community. They're key partnership meetings to attend. So we all work together to share vital information to disrupt exploitation. There's no hierarchy in these meetings. They're a safe space for people to come together, to share concerns, to think outside the box, to be really creative about what they can do to disrupt exploitation in their area. I am going to touch very briefly on trafficking in modern slavery and the national referral mechanism. Now, we've got lots of information on this on our website. So again, we've got it all together, and we'll make sure everyone has links in the chat. But the national referral mechanism is the framework for identifying victims of trafficking, slavery, servitude, and forced or compulsory labour, and ensuring they receive the right support. So all police and local authority staff have a legal duty to refer anyone they think may potentially be a victim, not expected to be sure. And it's really, you know, if a child is being used for the benefit of others, including to commit any crime or to work inappropriately or to take part in any sexual activity, and they are being moved or kept anywhere for that purpose, then they are being trafficked, and an NRM must be submitted. So it's really important to consider here as well when we're talking about the movement of children. Again, sometimes you'll see a lot of coverage on the press around the trafficking of anyone really across countries or across county lines. The movement, the distance is irrelevant. So a young person can be moved from one street to another, can be moved from one room to another if we're thinking about hotels. And so is any movement would class as trafficking. And just an aside here, the national referral mechanism runs alongside safeguarding processes, so it's not something that would replace them. In North Yorkshire and York, we are currently taking part in a pilot for devolved decision making. So it means that the decisions around the whether a child is subject to modern slavery or trafficking sits locally within us as a partnership, rather than anywhere outside of the pilot. It sits with the Home Office as a national decision. And then finally, if you break down trafficking, it covers those 3 component parts. So you're looking at the action, so what's actually happened. The means, i.e. how that's happened, so through coercion, threats, abuse of power, for example, and the purpose, so whether that's to commit a crime or a sexual activity. But when we're talking about young people, it's really important to note that any child under the age of 18 cannot consent to their own exploitation. So there's no need to show any proof of the means in order to prove that a child's been trafficked. So again, in terms of all of our MACE processes, we've collated these and we've put all the information together in the form of 1-minute guides, which we'll pop the link in the chat. OK, let's move on to the crux of it. We're here to talk about disruption, and more importantly, what we can all do to disrupt exploitation. So the definition of disruption, I think, is really broad. To prevent something, a system, process or event from continuing as usual or as expected. So it's important when we consider how exploitation takes place, what it is that links our victim, our child at risk of exploitation, our offender, or our person who poses a risk of harm to our children, and our young people and the locations together. Without the 3 elements coming together, exploitation doesn't occur. Now, there's been a tendency historically to spend a great deal of time focusing solely on the child, looking at risk factors, maybe scoring those risk factors, looking for behaviours, for example, number of missings, whether they're taking substances, however. And while we absolutely should focus on supporting that child and their needs, and the risks that their vulnerabilities might make them susceptible to, if we don't shed an equal light on the offenders and the locations, then we are never really going to achieve effective disruption. We tend to only displace that problem to somewhere else, because that perpetrator will move on to another young person or another location of concern. Now, when we talk about exploitation, it can often just be attributed to the work of perhaps police, making arrests, or more targeted services, so for example children and families services or children's social care. However, it's really important to think about disruption on a much larger scale and as a multifaceted approach from a wide variety of partners. So again, over to you guys in the chat bar, please. If you can share who you think, in terms of partners or anybody, can be involved in the disruption of exploitation. If you want to share any examples of what they can do, by all means, but just pop some thoughts in the chat bar, please.
We've got police, early help, schools, parents, youth workers, a PIF form, I'm not quite sure what that is, families,
Amazing.
Housing.
Great. Thank you
local
for that.
Businesses.
Oh, I'm loving that one. Well done. Okay, so basically anyone can disrupt. So exploitation is like a jigsaw puzzle. Everyone has a little piece, that missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. No one piece on the puzzle can sometimes, can have that use on its own. It's about putting the pieces together. Now, when we talk about exploitation, due to the complex nature of it and the fact that vulnerability to exploitation can occur right through a child's life, starting from those early years up to and beyond their 18th birthday, thinking about disruption needs to be far wider than just that risk identification and the risk management. Now, to support this, it can be helpful to think about disruption in levels, thinking about what partners can do from kind of a primary, secondary and tertiary level. So if we look at that tertiary top level, we're looking at much more targeted disruption. So we're looking at targeting those directly affected by exploitation, perhaps both the young people through perhaps safety plans, risk management, but also through the disruption of the perpetrator. So perhaps issuing police child abduction warning notices. We'll go into that a little bit more detail later, but also in the physical places and spaces, and looking at much more targeted plans around what's actually going on. Important here is the multi-agency partnership working and that really key communication all the way through. Secondary, we're looking at more proactive disruption of potential targets and really building that intelligence-led, disruption-based picture based on data, intelligence that's coming in, looking at potential hotspots, identifications of cross-border links, potential networks, looking at groups of vulnerable young people and whether or not any group intervention can be put in place, really picking up and identifying on those vulnerabilities, both on the places and spaces and the young people. And then finally, when you look at that primary and universal stage, that there's no accident that this is a triangle. That bottom section should be considered the biggest section in terms of disruption. It's all about raising awareness. And it's all about kind of that community campaign work, that school-based education, raising awareness to young people and parents, and training to deliver to different services to really increase that awareness and kind of pick up on some of those early warning signs as much as possible. So who undertakes disruption? You put loads of these in the chat earlier, which is amazing. But I just kind of wanted to just highlight a couple here just to kind of get you thinking a little bit more, get you thinking outside the box. So again, these are key services that can spot signs in terms of gathering information, picking things up in terms of disruption. So if we look at, let's say we've got a hotelier, you may be picking up on a frequent guest at a hotel room, seen with a range of different young people. You may be picking up on guests refusing to provide ID or providing false names, or only wanting to pay cash. Taxi drivers and those young people, those who are transporting young people, again, you may pick up on young people, boys and girls, being collected and taken to hotels, B&Bs, parties at odd times. You may pick up on young people being picked up from that transport by another car and kind of being moved between transport. And again, young people looking perhaps worried, frightened or distressed in the company of adults where it doesn't look like there's a positive relationship there, or something that, again, as professionals, you doesn't seem to sit right with you. Again, we've had this with taxi drivers where they've picked young people up and they've noticed that sign and they've taken them directly to a police station because they've thought there was an immediate concern there. Thinking again outside the box when we talked about financial exploitation, if you look at, for example, banking staff, children who are exploited will often carry cash, so obtained from their exploitation, and they'll visit bank branches to pay that in, often to abusers' accounts. And they may also be made to launder money or transfer criminal proceedings through their own bank accounts. So again, concerning activity around that young person's account, visiting a branch that's far from home address, you know, paying in large quantities of cash, being instructed or controlled by another individual, someone keeping an eye on them from a distance. Lots of subtle things that can be picked up out and about in community spaces that are so key in terms of really thinking about disruption and picking up these signs as early as possible. Now, from a North Yorkshire perspective, when we talk about disruption, one of the key elements in relation to this is the sharing of intelligence. And in North Yorkshire, we do this through our partnership information sharing form. Gemma's going to pop this in the chat for you so you've got access to it as well. But this really is a key and safe way to share those concerning incidents or suspicious activities, those unusual exchanges, those things that make you as a professional sometimes make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. It doesn't supersede a safeguarding referral. Obviously, you've got those concerns around a young person, you would submit a safeguarding referral. But these are those little nuggets, those little pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, you know, that you're all out there working with young people. And it's, you know, those conversations that you're having around places and spaces, places where young people are gathering, whether they're being approached by adults around particular locations, things that you're just not quite sure what to do with, feeling it may not be that useful, but from a MACE perspective, they are key bits of information. So I would say if you're not sure, I would share it anyway, because it is taken through a police system, it's all secure, so they will kind of go through all that intelligence and rate it anyway. But the intelligence comes together at our MACE level 2 meetings, and that's where we really put all the pieces together and think about that disruption. So again, if you're in these multi-agency meetings, if you're having these conversations with young people, make sure that as part of that you take an action as to who will be submitting that intelligence. Even if you're in a meeting with a police officer, don't just take it as an assumption of, oh, well, there was police there, they've picked up on it, it will go through. It still needs to be submitted through the usual channels. So it just needs that clarity of who will do that and follow up on it as well. It would be better to go through twice than not at all. So just make sure that it is actually going through. And again, if anyone has any further questions around what sort of things to put on the form or anything like that, we've got lots of that on the website if you want to follow the link. We've got a couple of little short videos on there as well. Another really key document here is a national document, the Home Office Child Exploitation Disruption Toolkit, and it is that really key toolkit to support frontline practitioners to safeguard children against exploitation. So again, looking again at those different levels, firstly through building an accurate picture of the nature and extent of exploitation through mapping, problem profiling, intelligence, things like that. And then secondly, with those specific measures that can be put in place by professionals, be that focusing on the victim, the child, or the location. So let's look at some examples of disruption and what this can actually look like in real context. So I'm going to introduce you to Alfie. Now, some of you may have seen this video before. It's about a 7 or 8 minute video, and it takes you through kind of Alfie's story of exploitation and being groomed. Now, as you're watching the video, please feel free to kind of contribute as you're watching, or if ideas come to you as you're watching in the chat. But I want you to think about at what points in this video could disruption have taken place. By who could have done it, what could they have done, and what impact could it have had? So again, no silly comments or anything like that. If you've got any creative ideas, please pop them in, because anything is always helpful to consider. But think outside the box. Think about what could have been done in Alfie's situation that maybe could have provided a little bit of disruption. So I'm going to play the video now. Like I say, it's about 7 minutes, and then we'll come back together in the chat.
I kept walking, tried not to show how much it hurt. People were looking at me funny, or not looking at me at all. Bruises were swelling up all over. Pain shot through me as I felt the crunch of broken glass beneath my feet. A woman coming the other way shook her head and muttered something. "You what?" She looked at me like I was scum. I stared at her as I carried on, and I wasn't looking where I was going and tripped. It absolutely killed. I didn't want anyone to see I was crying. I shouted angrily after the woman, but she wouldn't hear me. I knew I had to keep moving. I still had a 10-minute walk until I would get home. I was always embarrassed if one of my friends came to our flat. The windows were boarded up, and we didn't have proper furniture. It was a mess, and most days Mum was drunk. One of my mates made a big deal about us not having carpets or wallpaper. After that, I didn't ask anyone else around. I just hung about the streets and parks. When I started secondary school, I made new mates. And there was nothing to do, so we made our own fun. We were banned from most of the shops. I got caught nicking once, and the shopkeeper held me prisoner until the old bill got there. They took me home, and Mum went mad that I brought coppers around. I don't understand why she was bothered. I never had any money, but some of my older mates did. They started buying us drinks, cans of Coke, and sometimes beer. They shared out fags, and I thought they were real generous. I asked Alex where he was getting his money from, and he said it was from his fam. Alex was in care and hadn't seen his mum for years, so I don't understand what he meant. He said that he'd introduce me one day. One time me and Alex were having a fag, when he got a call on his crappy little Nokia phone that I'd never seen before. Alex said that he had to go see Dave, and that I could come with him. The address he'd been given was a dirty looking house. Alex told me to wait near the door, as he'd only be a minute. I saw Dave slyly pass Alex a wrapped up bag that Alex quickly shoved into his bag. Dave looked at me and nodded. Then we left. For my 13th birthday, I really hoped that Mum got me some new trainers, as mine were wrecked. But instead she gave me some DVDs she got down at the pub. I said thanks, but didn't tell her that we didn't have a DVD player, or that I sold them. On the night, Alex gave me some beer and a joint, and we got smashed. It was a right laugh. Dave turned up and said he heard it was my birthday, and that I needed some new trainers. I couldn't believe it when he gave me 80 quid and told me to go treat myself. I didn't know what to say, but he just smiled and said, "This is what families do for each other." And I told him I owed him one, and he told me not to worry about it. I hung out with the group more and more. They helped me to see that we needed to stick together, because everyone else was against us. One night, Dave asked me to help him by holding onto a bag for a few days for him. I told him of course I would, and was surprised when he gave me another 100 quid and told me not to go mess with it. I took it home and hid it. I was dying to know what was in it, but I didn't look. Dave trusted me and gave me more money than I'd ever held in my hands before. I hid that too, as I didn't want Mum finding it and asking questions or spending it. After that I did more jobs for Dave. Alex said that I was a proper part of the street fam now. He had a phone that only the fam could reach him on, and he was going away a lot, out of town. We had more money and new experiences than we'd ever had. It was amazing. I knew what was paying for all of this. We were moving and selling drugs, but we were doing it as a family. and it felt good that they believed me to do it right. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a good future, like I was in control. I was moving small amounts. The drugs were already wrapped, and I had to hide them in something like a drawstring bag or a paracetamol box. I was out one day when Dave pulled up in his car. He'd asked me if I'd seen Alex. I hadn't. He told me that when I did, I had to tell him that it was all over.
See Alex, you tell him he's out.
Alright.
Alright,
And he told me I should meet him on Friday at 9 at the usual place. He said it was time I stepped up. It was Friday afternoon and I did see Alex, but it was being off with me. I told him what Dave said. He showed me that he had a tag on his ankle, and he said Dave would want me more now, as I was still clean. He looked at me strange. Funny thing is, getting his tag has given me my freedom. That was the last time I ever saw of him. I met Dave. He said I was going for a ride with Jay. I went to go and get in Jay's car, but he stopped me and popped the boot open and told me to get in.
No. Get in.
At first, I thought he was joking, but he looked dead serious. We travelled for over an hour. It was horrible, and a couple of times I started to freak out. When we finally got there, Jay led me into a house. Everyone inside was out of it. There was this big guy on the sofa with a young girl, and Jay told this nervous-looking guy to get the stuff. He fetched a bag of heroin and then slumped into a chair.
There's a phone. Don't miss the calls. I'll be back in a few days for the money.
He told me to take the calls and sell drugs until he came back. I stood there and didn't know what to do. I sat down for a fag with my hands trembling. I was there for 3 days. I took calls on the phone and all sorts of people came to the door. I let them in and sold them drugs. Sometimes they stayed there for a few hours. Sometimes they were straight off. The nervous guy stayed. He was always high. And I figured this must have been his house. I counted the money I'd taken. There was more than a couple of grand, and I kept it close to me. I was starving and bored, so I was relieved when Jay came back. He took the money but gave me a couple of notes and told me to get the train home. He said to take a packet back home with me. I tried to tell him that I didn't even know how to get a train and that the packet was too big for me to hide inside my mouth. He told me I should hide it up in my ass. It really hurt. When I finally got home, I was knackered. Then Mum gave me the, "Where the hell have you been?" She said she'd nearly had to report me missing and get the coppers round again. I just needed some rest.
Alfie, I'm talking to you!
And tried to get my head straight. Next day I saw Dave. He told me to get in the car.
You alright?
He gave me 200 quid and smiled. He said, "How else would you earn money like that, Alfie? You're with us now." He said he'd take me to get a haircut. He told me that I was doing well and that he was proud of me. No one had ever said that to me before.
Okay, so that is the end of part 1 of Alfie's story. There are more bits to Alfie's story, and I'm pleased to say there is a little happy ending at the end for him. But Gemma, did anything come through in the chat about any times during that video when people picked up on anything that we could have put in place to disrupt what was going on?
No, there's nothing come through as yet.
Okay, no problem. We will move on, and I'll just put some of the key points that came up, just in terms of kind of my thoughts from watching the video. So if we think about Alfie and what was going on, I'd like you to kind of consider some of the intelligence that may have been coming in from local communities and businesses. So, for example, you've got Alfie and some of his mates who were maybe shoplifting a little bit. You saw Alfie at the beginning with injuries. You've got groups of young people smoking and drinking. Who's raising those concerns in the community? How is that intelligence being shared? How are we gathering it so we can look at potential places and spaces where Alfie and his mates are spending time, and the concerns around that? I'm also interested very much in mum's network. You know, what support is mum getting? She shares that she doesn't want kind of people involved, and she's not sharing with school that Alfie's gone missing for those few days, maybe kind of calling him in sick. But are there any support networks around mum? So perhaps is she getting some housing support? Is she getting any support in terms of her alcohol use? Is she got some peer support? The way she's talking to people and she's saying, actually, I'm worried about Alfie, this is happening. You know, he's got these new trainers, this, you know, he's going missing, what's going on? Who's kind of having those conversations with mum where we can start to, again, think about building that picture and supporting mum with some of that disruption? And again, Alfie and his mates, you know, they're saying quite clearly there's nothing for him and his mates to do. Is there things that we can be doing in terms of disruption and diversionary activity, looking at youth sessions, group sessions that can be put in place? When Alfie's trafficked, he's taken to a trap house for the drug dealing. And again, are we getting that intelligence coming from local communities about that house? You know, communities sharing people coming to the door at different times, perhaps a smell of cannabis or something like that. Who's that being fed to? How are we building that intelligence picture? And, you know, Dave, when we talk about Dave and that clear perpetrator of exploitation, what intelligence are we getting from communities, from concerned parents? You know, we spoke about there was another young boy who went on tag as a result of what's going on. You know, we've clearly got adults here who are targeting and spending time with young males. What information have we got? What information can we gather? You know, where are they spending time? What can we gather about the car? Can we look at kind of the make and model of the car and share that information with partners? Police can look at things like tracking the movement of the car if they're looking at we've got them as a registered perpetrator. And then we also look at police intervention, so perhaps issuing that kind of child abduction warning notice just to let police know, so the police can let Dave and his associates know that they are aware of what's going on and give them that warning that if it continues, they will be looking at kind of criminal procedures moving forwards. And again, really looking at building that picture so we can adopt Dave and his associates as a perpetrator of exploitation, so that can lead to further police disruption. And if we look at Alfie, you know, who are those networks around Alfie? Who's noticing the changes? You know, he's going to school, albeit he's missing some school, but he is going. Who's picking up on those changes? Who's picking up on the new trainers? Where's that curiosity around him missing from school? Has there been any support offered for mum in relation to targeted youth support or information through children and families? If there's any concerns around exploitation, perhaps again linking in with Parents Against Child Exploitation, so mum can have that information and awareness raising with her as well. So again, what can be put in place? Can we look at any group intervention that can be put in through schools? And then finally, if we look at the NRM, so Alfie is clearly being moved for the purposes of exploitation. He's being trafficked. So again, if we've got professionals that have got eyes on this family, we can be looking at the submission of a national referral mechanism. And it's that really strong disruption tool in terms of identification and assuring that Alfie is seen as a victim in this so that he can get that right support put in place for him. And again, let's just have a look, moving on from Alfie, a couple of other just really brief case examples, just to give you a really clear idea around some ways that which that disruption can actually look like. These are some examples that we've put together based on some work that's happened in North Yorkshire. So let's start with an example of disruption around a young person. So we've got a young person here, a 16-year-old, who is at high risk of criminal exploitation. Now, they are unable to maintain a place in school, struggling to complete any qualifications, and perpetrators, again, they'll target that young person based on that breakdown of that school relationship. They know they're not in school, they know they may be struggling a little bit with confidence, maybe kind of thinking for things for them to do during the day when they don't have those professional eyes on them. So again, it all links to that kind of high level of risk of criminal exploitation. So professionals working with that young person managed to hold on to a level of relationship with that young person and really considered that creativity of support. So they knew that young person had an interest in building, and they made a connection with a local builder who was able to offer some work experience. Now that young person starts to build a little bit of confidence, starts to realise that there are other options available, starts to develop a positive network of support around them, based on kind of that employment and that creativity of thinking about the network, not necessarily being targeted support, but just offering that young person another outlet, something for them to do. Now, this can be anything. This can be, like you say, an employment opportunity, but it can be through sports networks, wider family and friends, different peer groups, religious support services, or anything like that. So it's really thinking outside the box. So another example is we have a group of young people. Now, early indicators that there are concerns around exploitation with this group of young people, lots of missing episodes between them, but currently unable to ascertain any location, so they're not sharing any information when they have returned home, but there really is concern starting to gather around exploitation. There's some concerns around drug use, and again, some of those early warning signs starting to pick up. Now, lots of engagement goes in with these young people, but partners are really struggling to encourage those young people to receive that support and engage in that support. So again, thinking creatively, professionals were having those conversations with parents who were obviously very worried about what was going on, but they linked those parents together. So with consent, they looked at sharing numbers, they agreed safety plans so they could keep in touch and communicate where their children were, starting to build that bigger picture and again feeding that intelligence back. Another one, so we've got a 13-year-old, again, warning signs identified through mapping exercises of associates linked with that young person. So this young person is being picked up as vulnerable based on their links of other young people who are already being exploited. Now, the sharing of intelligence built that picture of what was going on, and it led to the identification of a perpetrator who was linked to this young person amongst the others. Support and diversionary activities were offered both to that young person and the group around them, and the perpetrator became the person who was there was concerns around exploitation became an adopted perpetrator. A child abduction warning notice was issued, so again used to disrupt that adult's association with those young people and warn that if it continues, we'll be looking at arrest and prosecution. So again, it's examples of picking up those early warning signs, thinking of all the different things that can be put in place. And then finally, if we think about more kind of location and place-based disruption, we can see concerns raised around a group of young people spending time in and around a local hotel, and they were seen spending time in the company with older males. So alongside the disruption work that was offered to the young people, there was a lot of disruption work based on the location as well. So it was raised as a location of concern in our MACE level 2 meetings, and there was a big push for intelligence gathering from partners. So we could really start to build a picture of what was going on, when and where. The police response was agreed with a plan, and that included that regular visual police presence at the hotel. And again, meetings were held with hotel staff and management to look at sharing that intel, to have really clear plans in place in terms of raising their concerns, and to deliver training around exploitation, what it looks like, and picking up on some of those warning signs. So again, really thinking about what that disruption can look like, not just based on the young person, but also around those spaces. Okay, so just kind of wrapping up and following on from the ideas that we've talked about in terms of disruption, in terms of early intervention, I wanted to share with you our North Yorkshire hub, which is the Be Aware Knowledge Hub. So it's our one-stop shop for all our information covering exploitation. We've got all the resources on there, and we keep it as up to date as we possibly can. So any new resources or national trends we will put on there and collate, so you know from a North Yorkshire perspective, you can go on there and everything's kind of where you want it to be. We also have on the site specific entry points for parents and carers, young people and communities and local businesses. The content of these pages was developed in collaboration with young people and parents who've been victims of exploitation, and it was based on them telling us what they felt they wanted to know on these pages. So for young people, it's all around keeping safe, what exploitation actually looks like, kind of using their language, and for parents it's all around delivering those key safety messages, what they can do if they're worried, and again, communities and local businesses training and information about what you can look out for and what you can do if you're worried. Oh, sorry. So just finally, I want to share one final very short video with you just before we wrap up. And this is just in relation to when we're considering victims of exploitation and being really mindful of the language that we use around young people. It's a nice way to finish. It really kind of gets us considering young people being victims. So yeah, it's just about a minute long. You can watch the last video.
These are real statements that professionals have used to describe victims of child sexual exploitation.
The language you use matters.
It affects how people see us.
It makes us feel like what's been done to us is our fault.
And it makes us feel less of a person.
Professionals need to recognise our vulnerability.
We want you to see us as children and as victims.
The only person that should be blamed is the perpetrator.
We depend on you professionals to keep us safe.
Negative language reinforces negative attitudes to victims of exploitation.
And negative attitudes lead to systematic failures to protect us.
Helping us starts with the language you use, so choose it carefully.
Thank you.
Okay, so for me, I love watching that video. It always strikes home just that really key point around considering young people and the families around them as victims, and really that's such a key for disruption. So just be mindful of it, be mindful of the language that we're using, the language that we're writing when we're working with young people, and really think about kind of, if it was you, how would you feel if some of that language was written or said about you when we're working with young people. We do again have that video and a series of toolkits, as well as kind of practice principles and some questions for reflection in terms of the language that we use when we're talking about young people who are victims of exploitation. Again, all collated on our Be Aware Knowledge Hub. I think Gemma is going to put something in the chat. So that is the final slide from me. I'm going to stop the presentation in a moment and just open it up if anyone's got any questions, but I would really appreciate if you would put some bits in terms of feedback in the chat. You know, anything that you've learned, anything that you're going to go back and share with colleagues, any actions that you've taken out of this session today. You know, how are you going to be disruptive? You know, how are you going to cause a bit of a nuisance to some of these perpetrators? Happy to take any questions, but I will just finish off by saying a massive thank you. Keep being curious, keep being creative, keep being tenacious when it comes to disruption, and let's just keep making a positive impact with this. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop presenting, but please pop some bits in the chat.